how money and power have intertwined throughout modern history and what that connection tells us about the world we navigate today. Our guide for this journey is Niall Ferguson's insightful book, The Cash Nexus: Money and Power in the Modern World, 1700-2000. Think of it as a quest, maybe, to understand not just what happened in history, but why it profoundly matters. Connecting the dots between, well, mundane tax bills, huge national debts, the outcomes of wars, and even the twists and turns of election results. It's really a shortcut, perhaps, to being well-informed about the often hidden financial forces shaping our societies.
And what's truly illuminating in Ferguson's work, I think, is how he challenges some of our core assumptions. He pushes us to look beyond, simple economic determinism and instead consider the intricate dance between finance, politics, and even human psychology. Throughout our conversation today, we'll explore the fundamental ways states get their money, what happens when they print too much, and crucially, whether a robust economy automatically guarantees political success.
Right. So to truly understand how money and power intertwine, Ferguson urges us to begin at the most fundamental level. How states throughout history have financed their biggest, most resource-intensive activities, which often meant, well, war. From the War of the Spanish Succession to the Napoleonic Wars, these conflicts just dramatically escalated the percentage of a nation's wealth poured into defense.
And placing this within that broader historical context, a crucial question comes up. How did states actually pay for these massive conflicts? Well, one key was the constant evolution of taxation. Take the British excise duties, for instance. These were basically indirect taxes on goods and services. Dr. Johnson famously called them a hateful tax levied upon commodities. They started back in the Stuart period, but they expanded significantly to fund wars, taxing pretty much everything imaginable from salt to even female servants.
Yeah, and what struck me as particularly insightful in Ferguson's analysis of tax is the story of income tax. It was formerly temporary when Peel introduced it in 1842, right? But it proved to be, as Ferguson puts it, indestructible. Why was a tax that was meant to be temporary just so resilient? I mean, there was even that naval officer in 1799 calling it a vile Jacobin, jumped up jacking off his piece of impertinence.
That's a perfect example, isn't it? How financial innovations just become embedded. And this links directly to the idea of consensual taxation. England, you see, with its long history of parliamentary approval for taxes, was able to sustain much higher tax burdens than absolute monarchies like France. However, it also led to what Ferguson calls representation without direct taxation for a lot of the electorate, because property holders initially bore the brunt of income tax. And that, in turn, fueled growing pressure for higher government spending by the late 19th century.
Okay, so beyond taxes, states piled up these immense public debts, what Ferguson vividly calls mountains of the moon. He highlights Britain's institutional square of power, that's the excise, Parliament, the national debt, and the Bank of England. This unique combination let Britain borrow cheaply and effectively, especially when you compare it to, say, the French system, which was much more fragmented, selling offices, relying on short-term loans.
Exactly. That square of power was absolutely crucial. Ferguson shows that Britain's system wasn't just about getting money, it was a masterclass in building financial credibility. This integration of effective taxation, parliamentary oversight, a stable national debt, and a reliable central bank, it created the trust needed to borrow cheaply and consistently. While France often resorted to defaults, think of the drastic handling of John Law's financial bubble-bursting Britain's system allowed for stability, even when the Bank of England had to suspend gold convertibility for long stretches. This historical context really illuminates why some countries could successfully wage wars of credit, while others just stumbled.
So what happens when states can't collect enough in taxes or borrow enough? This is where Ferguson brings in the idea of the inflation tax. They basically turn to the printing press, right? Devaluing their own currency.
Yeah.
The French Revolution's eniads are a classic example of this paper currency initially backed by confiscated church lands. But it quickly spiraled into hyperinflation. Their purchasing power just plummeted from 91% down to, 0.5% in just 5 years.
And beyond the sheer numbers, Ferguson really digs into the profound psychological impact of hyperinflation. Elias Canetti's memoir of 1923, Frankfurt, it vividly describes German hyperinflation as a demon with a gigantic whip, lashing at everything and reaching people down to their most private nooks and crannies. He even mentions artists like Ebbe Warburg having nervous breakdowns, terrified by visions of cultural devaluation from mass-produced art reproductions. It's a powerful reminder, that economic instability has these deep human costs.
And central banks, like the U.S. Federal Reserve, they've played this huge, often controversial role in these monetary stories. Ferguson notes that if you could blame a single agency for how bad the Great Depression got, it was the Fed, for misusing its powers and repeatedly doing the wrong thing after 1929. Even things like actively stopping new gold from stimulating the money supply, sterilizing gold inflows, he calls it, and raising interest rates when gold was leaving. That's a pretty strong indictment.
It is a strong critique, yeah. And it makes you ask about the fundamental role of central banks and interest rates. Interest rates, as Shakespeare Shylock knew very well, reflect risk. Historically, countries with a history of defaults, like France, they faced higher bond yields. It just costs them more to borrow. Ferguson emphasizes that unexpected inflation or default can cause these major distributional shifts, who gains, who loses. Especially when, like in Britain in the 1820s, debt payments were financed by regressive consumption taxes that hit lower-income people harder. It effectively transferred wealth from the poor majority to this tiny, rich elite who held the bonds.
Okay, so we've looked at the historical mechanics of state finance, the hidden costs of monetary power. Let's now turn to the electoral arena. There's a strong popular belief, isn't there, that economic performance directly decides elections. We've all heard the narratives around President Clinton's approval ratings staying high despite scandal, or Reagan asking voters, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
Right, it seems intuitive, that feel-good factor. A good economy equals political popularity. But what's genuinely insightful is Ferguson's argument that the long-run evidence, particularly in Britain, often shows economic factors playing a, well, surprisingly minor role in election outcomes. He argues that big political events like the Falklands War or the hugely unpopular poll tax can actually drown out those economic relationships, making electoral behavior seem almost stochastic and unpredictable, as he puts it.
That's a fascinating counterpoint to the usual story. So if people don't always feel their vote directly impacts their economic situation, does this lead to things like Politikverdrossenheit, politics fatigue,
Yeah.
where voter turnout drops and public trust in politicians just kind of erodes?
Absolutely. Ferguson connects it directly to that disillusionment. When citizens feel like their vote doesn't tangibly improve their financial situation, disengagement can definitely set in. And this then leads us to think about the changing nature of political parties themselves. Ferguson highlights this trend of politics as business, with leaders like Tony Blair or Ross Perot using corporate management language. But as campaign cost soars and party memberships shrink often by more than half in some European countries, parties become more and more reliant on wealthy donors, which naturally raises concerns about influence and even potential corruption.
Yeah, speaking of corruption, Ferguson offers a more nuanced view on what that actually means. While outright bribery is clearly problematic, he points out that even things like the UK's honours system, where knighthoods and peerages might seem to correlate with party donations, could be seen as a form of recompense for political funding. A trade-off that is, in his view at least, fairly unobjectionable compared to directly buying policy influence. It's a subtle distinction he's making there. Ferguson highlights the truly massive scale of the international bond market. Over $34 trillion by 1999, he says, which was more than world GDP at the time. And more than half of all these bonds are government-issued. The U.S., in particular, is heavily indebted to foreign creditors. These staggering figures make you wonder, is this level of financial globalization totally new, or have we seen something like it before?
It's a great question, and Ferguson points out that the first age of globalization before 1914 saw similarly massive capital flows and migration. So many aspects are entirely unprecedented. However, he emphasizes a really key difference. The U.S., unlike Britain back in its imperial heyday, is a capital importer. This means its global financial position relies heavily on foreigners buying its long-term bonds, which raises different questions, about its vulnerability and its dependence on other nations' willingness to keep lending.
And then there's what Ferguson calls the illusion of peace. Enlightenment thinkers like Kant and Adam Smith were quite optimistic, arguing that commerce, that economic interdependence would make war obsolete. And more recently, you had Thomas Friedman's Golden Arches theory, the idea that countries with McDonald's wouldn't fight each other. But as Ferguson dryly points out, the Kosovo War started less than 2 months after Friedman's book came out, and there was definitely a McDonald's in Belgrade.
Yeah, that example really punctures the idea that economic ties alone guarantee peace. What Ferguson really uncovers here is that military outcomes are not strictly determined by who has the bigger economy. Germany's initial successes in both world wars, despite being economically weaker than its opponents, show that superior strategy, mobilization, morale, these can matter more, at least in the short run. And this leads him to a really crucial concept: understretch, which is a failure to spend enough on defense to properly deter potential aggressors, which, ironically, can lead to much more expensive full-blown wars later on.
Right. The British experience serves as a stark warning against this understretch. Insufficient defense spending led to costlier wars down the line. Ferguson argues the U.S. today risks a similar kind of strategic vulnerability. Despite its unmatched economic and military technological power, by not adequately funding its foreign policy goals, it could become susceptible to multiple smaller threats that might quickly escalate. It really makes you think about the true cost of saving money on defense, doesn't it? So what does all this mean for us? Ferguson's deep dive into this cash nexus fundamentally challenges us, I think, to look beyond just simple economic explanations for really complex historical and political events.
Ultimately, it prompts a truly profound question. What is power, really? It's clearly not just about GDP figures or tax rates or bond yields. Ferguson reminds us that the legitimacy of a state, its real power, is also intricately bound up in, well, intangibles. Things like tradition, the charisma of its leaders, popular belief in its future, and the effective use of propaganda.
Yeah, this journey through the cash nexus shows that the whole idea of homo economicus, the perfectly rational, self-interested person always driven by economic utility, is often a monstrous oversimplification. People are moved by so much more, by the urge to play, to idle, to connect, or even sometimes Ferguson notes, to wreck things. For you, who's joined us on this deep dive, understanding the intricate dance between cash, power, and these complex human motivations is truly key to a well-informed perspective on the world. Keep digging, keep questioning, and join us next time for another deep dive.